Okay, so we're going to officially go ahead and get started. Glad to see a bunch of people are here. We'll probably have more people joining, and we're a little long today, longer than we usually schedule. We usually have been scheduling for an hour, and we scheduled for 2 today. So people I suspect will be coming in and out. So glad to see everyone that's here. Some of you have been here for the other webinars, so great to have you back. If this is your first one, great to have you here. My name is Jill Perry, and I'm a counselor and have been honored to be sponsored by Beaver County Behavioral Health to do a series of webinars. We call them the Quarantine Mental Health Playlist, and really just give everyone a short break from the world, talk about real issues, things that we need to know, things that yes, we have a pandemic, but the world is still going on, so we need to still talk about those things. And then also hopefully just share some hope and peace that I think we could all use as well. So today I'm really excited. A couple things first. I want to thank Beaver County Behavioral Health for making this happen and allowing this to happen. I think it's really helpful. We've gotten great feedback from the other webinars, so we couldn't do it without them. I want to thank ETC, Jan and Kim in particular. They handle all the work behind the scenes for us, and they just do a fantastic job. So I always love working with them. We have a couple sessions coming up. We're talking today about some pretty heavy stuff, important stuff. And then we have 2 more webinars scheduled coming up. On Thursday, the 18th, we have a session called I Hate Public Speaking, which is a real song that we'll play during the webinar. And I'll be joined by Katina Hunter, who is a world champion speaking finalist. And we're going to talk about how to get over some of that public speaking issues, and particularly now that we've moved to a pretty virtual world, how some of those things have changed. And then on Friday the 26th, we have a session called Lean on Me, where we're going to be joined by Lauren Tomeko, and she works for Marquee. We're going to talk about the basics that everybody needs to take care of. We talk about getting people into treatment sometimes, but if they don't have childcare or they don't have a roof over their head or those types of things, they can't figure out their insurance, then they have trouble being successful. And so we're going to talk about how important those things are. Also, Lauren is a new mom. And so she's going to talk about what that's like to be a new mom during the pandemic, which being a new mom is hard enough. So during the pandemic, wow. So let's get moving on. Today, like I said, we are going to be talking about racism. We're going to be talking about protests. We're going to be talking about how we discuss these things with our children, which I think is such an important issue because as adults, I think it can be very overwhelming to us. So I can only imagine how overwhelming it is to our kids. So big, important topics, heavy, really heavy stuff. So just to get us started, I would invite everybody just to wherever you are, unless you're driving, don't do this if you're driving, but wherever you are, just take a moment to close your eyes, just take in a deep breath, hold it for a few seconds, and just let it out, and maybe take a couple of those. And today, while we're talking, we're going to ask everyone to be open-minded. We're going to ask everyone to be reflective, let's say. So if some of that gets heavy during the session while we're talking, then go back to breathing. That's the basics to keep us going. We have a couple things going on today that are a little different. One, we're going to be sharing some polls throughout the session that's going to ask you some questions, mostly multiple choice, and you can answer the questions, and then we will be able to share those results with the reports. So we're going to work on that. You'll see those polls pop up from time to time. And then some of the polls do have some open-ended questions that you can't answer in the poll. So we would ask if you want to share something about that you do that in the chat and just chat to everyone so that everyone can kind of see those answers. We also, during the webinar and at the end, will take questions and answers, we will take questions. We will hopefully give some answers. So if you have a question, there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or maybe it's to the right of your screen, wherever it is on your screen. But feel free to put a question in there, and we will make sure that we do our best to try to get to those. So onward, because we have really great guests today. I'm really excited. So as I introduce them, they're going to pop up on the screen. Some of these people you probably know and maybe even know well, and some of them are going to be new. The first, I guess, co-host that we have today, these are our local co-hosts, is Shon Owens, and he is the director of the Men and Boys Initiative of the Franklin Center of Beaver County. He coordinates programs, provides tools to men and fathers to support parenting, community policing, neighborhood support, education efforts, and other sorts of advocacy for the community. So Shon, welcome. Shon, I think you're muted. And our next guest, Dr. Donald Sheffield, who is one of my favorite speakers. He's an education consultant and the president of TAME Incorporated, which stands for Techniques Assisting Motivation and Excellence. He has provided extensive diversity training for corporations and businesses and schools, and he also does workshops for parenting, for parents to help them maximize the potential in their kids. And I have to say, when I finally got to go to one of Dr. Sheffield's trainings, I was in awe the whole time. Just a fantastic, very powerful message and speaker. So Dr. Sheffield, welcome.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
Our next co-host is Mark DeJoux. He is the associate pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Beaver, and his focus is primarily on local outreach, international mission, and church planting. So Mark, welcome, glad to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And then we have a special guest who is an Aliquippa native, but she's here actually from Harlem, where she resides now. She's an educator. She leads a dynamic team as principal of Scholars Middle School 2. So please help us welcome Lena Dowdell.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Okay, now, did we lose Mark?
No, I think his camera went out.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I'm still here. Let me get this.
That's
back
okay.
on.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. So to get us started, I want to run through kind of a recent timeline of events. And now I say recent because this timeline, if we looked, goes way, way back. This is not new. But the most recent issues, on February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed while he was jogging after he was pursued by two white men who later said they thought he was a burglary suspect. That happened in Georgia. Following that, on March 13th, Breonna Taylor was shot and killed in her home. Police awakened her and her boyfriend as they entered their home to serve a warrant in a narcotics case. The boyfriend shot at the plainclothes cop, and that officer returned fire and killed Taylor. There were no drugs found in that home. That happened in Kentucky. Fast forward to May 25th, Amy Cooper calls 911 on Christian Cooper, no relation, during an encounter about her unleashed dog. She stated, quote, "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life." Miss Cooper was consequently fired from her job at an investment firm after that video went viral. Later on May 25th, George Floyd died after a white police officer knelt on his neck for several minutes in a video that spread across social media, and that happened in Minnesota. May 26th, protests in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, began. May 27th, protesters clashed with police in Minneapolis, and protests began around the country, specifically in Memphis and Los Angeles. May 28th, the protests grew. As of now, we've had protests in all 50 states, and we've also had protests around the world. So is there anyone that just wants to share anything about that timeline there? Oh, sorry, I'm just running through some videos, some things here. This is a map of the country and where all the states have taken, all the protests have taken place. So no state has been left without being touched by this, which I think is important to recognize. And then crowds across the globe have been protesting for us and about police brutality. This is a picture of some of that happening across the world.
I would like to make a comment. And my comment would be, please understand when people are protesting, right, there are some good and there's some bad that come out of it, but the focus of it is for people to be heard in the issues that are before them. And the great Dr. Martin Luther King said it great, that riots are the language of the unheard.
Mm-hmm.
Protesters want to be heard about their issues. So I want you guys to have an open mind when you see people on TV and however the media portray it, however our news outlets portray it, understand that there is a message behind all of that, and understand that there's an outcry from our communities that says enough.
Yeah, I think that's important to recognize. I want to go over a couple demographics in our communities just to give us some kind of overall perspective. And then I do want to talk more about protesting. So in the United States, our population is 72% white, 12.7% African American, 17.8% Hispanic and Latino American. In Beaver County, we are 89.7% white, with a 5.91% African American, and 2.2% state that they are 2 or more races. So we're a little more heavily populated in Beaver County, the majority white, than the world, than the country. And I just think that's important just to keep in perspective. But one of the things I'd like to ask, and anyone can kind of jump in here.
Jill, can I say something about the demographics?
Please, Dr. Sheffield.
Thank you. One of the things that is concerning about the fact that we are so white in Beaver County, almost 90% of the population. And one of the dangers of understanding diversity, and particularly racism, is that isolation fosters it. It's like fertile soil for racism, because not only do we have a majority population, but we also live in isolation of each other. And that's scary. And so absence, our numbers in terms of diversity are relatively small compared to other communities. So when you look at that, and then you look at the fact that we are not only primarily a white county, but also an isolated county. We've got 14 school districts, many whose children rarely experience diversity. And so racism becomes kind of an offshoot of our demographics. And I think that's really important. I think that's one of the reasons why we've been more intentional about trying to ensure that we provide, trainings and experiences that will allow kids to experience diversity, and adults, because it's a danger zone for us because of our demographics.
Yeah, if I could just jump in also. So I've been listening and reading along in a text. And part of, to Dr. Sheffield's point, is like this absence of Blackness and what that means. And so the idea that what does the fact that there aren't many people of color say, right? That is almost as bad as if there are people of color and you're doing things or saying things against them. The absence is like, it's not valued here, you don't matter here, your voice is not recognized. And that is just as detrimental. So sometimes people think, well, we don't have those problems because there aren't any Mexicans here, there aren't any Black people here. Mm-hmm. But that in itself is an inherent issue and speaks to racism and that idea of white supremacy. And so thinking about what Dr. Sheffield is saying, it is the training, but it is also the representation. Like, representation is key. When you look out into your community, who's teaching you, who's standing before you as political figures, who are your law enforcement officers, all of those things, right? When you are not represented, that is a huge statement that says you're not valued, you're not wanted, you don't matter. And so that is also key to note.
That makes me think of this phrase that I saw that said, one of the similarities between COVID-19 and racism is people only feel like it is real if it affects them. So it kind of makes sense to me that if we're living in a white community and we don't have some diversity there, then you can easily feel like we don't have that problem. And it's not accurate. It's looked through a lens of that's just not accurate.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here too, I think that's one of the opportunities when protests like this happen, and it's in your face, is because now it does affect white communities too, even if just in their perception and their anxiety that's triggered there. And so you can go a couple different ways with that. You could look to the protest and look at it all as rioting and all of it as problematic. Or you could take the opportunity to say, I can develop some empathy here. If this is how I feel, a bit of unsettledness, my kind of homeostasis is being disrupted, I feel uncomfortable, maybe a little unsafe. How does that help me to sympathize in some ways with people who the reason for the protest is that constant feeling, constant feeling of potential danger.
Yes.
And so there's an opportunity there. I don't think that's usually how it's leveraged though.
Wow. Wow.
Can any of you speak a little bit to the history of protests? Shon, you started to touch on this. Can you kind of give us an idea and an understanding of the history of protests and the purpose?
As I was saying, it's really is to be heard, to be seen, as a point that Ms. Lena was making earlier. We want to be seen. In most of our communities, we are invisible, especially here in Beaver County, we are invisible. So we want to become visible and know that we possess something of value, something of worth to this community. Dr. Sheffield always talk about the value and the beauty of a salad, right? So what's a salad with just lettuce?
What is interesting, Shon, what is interesting is, protest has been a long time. I mean, the era of women not being able to vote, and the era of women's suffrage where women rose up and said, we have that right. Certainly protests have been with us for a long time, and it's about being heard. The sad thing about protests is that sometimes the frustration having to revisit things over and over and over again. And I think that's what's really plagued the Black community. Atrocities have been around for a long time. The only voice has been protests. And when you go back to Rosa Parks, and the bus boycott, that was a protest, because, Blacks were sitting in the back of the bus and she had to give up her seat. I mean, those kinds of things are crazy, but the protest hit home. Now, I just think that that's been a vehicle, for folks to get people's attention and to offset, which is a large amount of frustration that we're revisiting things over and over and over again. I think that's the tragedy of where we are today, that, even when Martin Luther King was assassinated and all of the things that arose at that time, don't even give rise to what's happening today in terms of the impact those have had. And I think Mark is right. I think we can see that finally protests are becoming much more quote unquote colored, much more diverse, much more attracting the attention of particularly white America. And I think that's what's made this time a little bit more unique, in that it's become, a rallying cry for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about how we talk to our kids later, but I want to say, I think some of that, Dr. Sheffield, I accredit to our kids, my kids, for example, generation. They're much more open than my parents were with me, and so I think more open with them, and I think they're even a whole nother level of beauty and openness about that. So
you saw that,
sign of hope.
You saw that also on the news. I think it was last night or this morning that I saw where one of the school districts that's predominantly white had a young man who just graduated, and they all came together to rally about Black Lives Matter. Now, this is unheard of, in a community that has very few African Americans, but the young folks and their parents were there holding out Black Lives Matter signs. And joining the cause. I mean, this is to see young folks saying, hey, this has got to stop. It's just an amazing thing about this movement.
Yeah. And so this question about protests, and then I want to talk about some of the ones we've had locally, but protests and riots get kind of lumped in together. And I know the protest that was in Beaver Falls this past weekend, my daughter went to, and she really found it very powerful. But she had some friends' parents who wouldn't allow her friends to go because they said it might be dangerous or you don't know what's going to happen. And there's, I said to my daughter, well, there's truth to that. There's a lot of emotions going on and a lot of people. And so things could happen, but that shouldn't keep you from standing up for what you need to do. But I think some of that comes from that, is people would get confused between a protest and a riot. So could someone still speak to that a little bit?
I mean, my thoughts about this are, I don't think that anyone who is out on the front lines protesting for justice and equality and to be heard steps out of their home with the intent of a riot. I don't believe that in good faith. I don't see that to be a feeling. But I also want to caution or ask you to ask yourself the question, if you felt like you were constantly in fear, right? Because you made that point, or those things that family said, they don't know what's going to happen. Yep, I don't know what's going to happen when I walk outside of my door either. Right here in Rainbow Drive in Center Township, I go for a walk and my dad says, Lena, take your license. I'm 34 years old, just in case some of my white neighbors don't know that I live here, right? So I don't know either what's going to happen when I walk down the street and all of those things. So I don't think anyone walks out of their door and says, I'm going to go tear some things up. I think sometimes in these situations, they're confronted with things. I think that there are agitators amongst people who know that we are a people. All of us who are out there united and marching and protesting are already agitated. And we know that when you are in your reptilian brain, right? And you're filled with these emotions, it only takes a little bit of poking to get me upset. I also think that there have been agitations that come from law enforcement that have caused people or pushed them over the line just a little bit. And that is not to say that it is okay to hurt others or any of those things, right? Like, I'm not condoning either side, but I want to have you all question or to pause and ask yourself those questions in that very real moment, that all of us have had those visceral reactions and emotional outpours. Most of the time they just happen to be in our home when we have our breakdowns or our explosions or whatever the case may be, right? This is just a public display of the hurt and the injustice, right? Because you all are just starting to see on the surface what's been happening for years, decades. Like, this is not new to us. And so it's hard. And when you think about, this could be my son, or it was your brother, or it was your sister, it's just enough. And so they get lumped in because they often happen over each other. But then I also say, and we've seen these posts also, right? Like, when WVU has a football game and they win, they go and tear things down and nobody says anything because it's just a celebration. They're expressing themselves. They're young, right? And so where is our grace? Where is our space for these people are frustrated? We are murdering their husbands, their wives, their children in the street. Where is that grace for us? So I'm gonna pause because I found myself getting a little emotional.
Oh, emotional.
But
well, Lena, what really struck me about what you said there, and I just never thought about it this way. We're going to talk about white privilege later, and so this taps into that. Is, here I am saying to my white daughter, do what's right, but be careful, because you're right. Under these circumstances, there is a lot of emotion and stuff going on. You don't know what might happen. And that's what Black people experience every day. So my daughter had to experience it that day. And probably more than just that day, but not every time she walks out the door. I've never quite heard it expressed that way or heard it that way, I guess. So thank you for that. I think it is important. You tapped on the reptilian brain, Lena, and I think, as a therapist, I certainly look at, this is emotional topics. And what happens when people get emotional? Sometimes they get angry. Sometimes they get depressed. Sometimes they pull back and become timid. there's a whole range of things that can happen. Sometimes they act out of the ordinary. And so I think those are important things to remember when we're talking about and dealing with these issues. Dr. Sheffield, you wanted to say something?
There's a very interesting comment that was made to me the other day that I have to share with you all. And it was said in the context of the protests. And it was said rather angrily by this person who happened to be white. And what she said was, kind of angrily, we have our pandemic going on. Why are people out there demonstrating when they know we could pass things from one to the other? It doesn't make sense to me. And I'm sitting there like, whoa. And, and she was angry. And I said, I want you to think about it this way. What would make people risk their health to get out there and demonstrate over a cause that has moved them so much? What would make them do that? I think that's the bigger question, because that's what's happening. And I think it's also part of that misconception, that some people have about demonstrations. These folks are frustrated. We are so frustrated. We have been over this over and over and over again, and enough is enough, and so how can we get folks to see that that's really where we are right now? And that's what's happening. That's why the demonstrations.
Yeah. I've had some conversations recently that made me angry with people that are like, free speech. I get to say whatever I want. I can criticize my politicians. I can criticize the COVID and I don't, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's great. But you can't protest because that makes me uncomfortable. So do we have free speech or do we not have free speech? And it has to, that's one of the things that I think we're looking at.
It depends on the issue.
And right, exactly. And is that how it's supposed to be? Not really.
What I find is interesting right now, if you look at protests in another way, look at all the attention that's being paid to the monuments that show, or the American flag. I mean, let's face it, NASCAR just said that, no more Confederate flags.
Confederate flag.
Oh yeah, and a lot of the monuments to those that would celebrate generals of the Civil War and the naming of some of our army installations, links to the Confederacy. I mean, this is a protest, and in many respects, they're being carried on by sensitive white folks who see this as something they need to act on. That's what's amazing to me. Some of this is directly related to, things that folks are now looking at saying, is this honorable to our Black population?
And it's part of our history. That's fine. We're not we don't need to ignore it, but we don't need to celebrate it.
I think we need to celebrate, but I think in so many ways, it belongs in a museum, not necessarily in front of the Capitol. You follow me? Right. I think that's the key. It's history, and that's where history should be. And I do agree. It is part of our history, and folks need to know this and see this. But it's more bigger question of where should it be displayed? For folks to really understand the context of it.
And Dr. Sheffield, that reminds me of Brian Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative and the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, which usually gets called the lynching memorial, right? And so the importance, if you were to go to Germany, you can't go 20 feet without seeing some kind of marker of the atrocities of the Holocaust, because they know that they can't forget that so as to not repeat it. And so we do need to, what you're saying, Dr. Sheffield, I absolutely agree. We can't pretend it's not there. We need to not celebrate it. It is not a nostalgic thing. But the reality of white supremacy is it is still a nostalgic thing for that power structure, right? And so that's the contention, I guess, I have with the response to protest, where it is, the problem with the protest now is that it's too violent. The problem with the protest when Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem was about the military, it's always obfuscating, right? Because it's actually the substance of the protests that white supremacy doesn't want to give up that power. And so it's going to find a way to get around the conversation instead of addressing the issue head on, right? Which is what we need to do. We have to be clear-eyed and address it head on.
That's making the point to us being invisible. So if we're not valued, then our opinions never are valued. So, you know, they change our protests and they give them words that have a negative connotation to them, you know, versus us just making an expression, right? We want to make an expression of our outrage, of our anger, of our frustration, of, you know, dating back to the 1600s when the first ship landed somewhere in Virginia, right? And all of that was predicated on wealth, terror, right? All of that. So we want to continue this narrative. We want to continue this story on Black people's back and at their cost without thought. So those are the things we have to begin to start to think about. What are Black people feeling in America? We have never been valued, ever. Never been valued. At least the Native Americans have had some reprieve. They've had some things, you know, handed to them to say, hey, we're sorry. Here, take this piece of land, take this. Black people have never received that.
You know, followed on your point, Shon, someone had put in the chat, Sally said, our country was founded on a protest and demonstration. Have we forgotten about the Boston Tea Party? And some of the founding men of this country took part in the protest to bring about change.
Man, come on.
That taps into.
Absolutely. And the whole notion of taxation without representation caused a whole lot of ruckus back in the colonial days.
Right.
It's interesting what Mark said about Kaepernick and how he was vilified, vilified for taking a knee, not in disrespect for the flag or America, but to express on his venue how ugly police brutality was in America and it needed to stop. And he just took a knee in nonviolent protest.
Yeah.
And he was vilified, lost his job, still is without a job. And the NFL owes this guy something. Because now they're coming out, of course, in support of, but what are you gonna do to redeem yourselves for what you did to Kaepernick? Because that was totally unfair. And it really speaks to the hypocrisy of America, that you would chastise, you know, some of the things that happen in a protest that may become violent and associate that with the protests, when the fact of the matter is you don't like protests anyway, and Kaepernick showed it in a nonviolent way, and let's see what happens. So we need to redeem this guy, and we need to get on board with the fact that folks express nonviolent protests in their own arena is something good for America.
I want to share a couple things here real quick. This little out of order here, but this speaks to what you were talking about there. I saw this last night. It says, okay, who wants change? And everybody does. Everybody wants change. Woo! And now who wants to change? Nobody. So I thought that really spoke to what's happening. We have had the protests here in the county. I want to talk a little bit about those. Here's a picture of the first one. I believe it was the first one in Aliquippa. And there's Herb Bailey from Uncommon Grounds, and there's the mayor there. And then we had the one in Beaver Falls this past weekend, which my daughter was able to attend and did, like I said, found it very, very powerful. I thought that was a really great experience for her. And then we have now, so does anyone want to speak to any of the protests that have happened so far? I haven't heard of anything that got out of hand without any of the protests. I think that they is that accurate?
Yeah, I was, so I've lived pastored in downtown Beaver Falls for the last decade, and last 2 Sundays ago, so there was the bigger
Right.
march and protest this past Saturday. The Sunday before, there was one that was put on, and it probably had 150 people, so I was able to be a part of both of those. That Sunday morning before that first Beaver Falls protest, I can't tell you how many calls and texts I got from people saying, you know, that they're busted in rioters, and, you know, look out, they're going to burn the city down. The National Guard has been called in. And so just the generation of that anxiety with no substance to it, right? I mean, I think that it's not like something happened and people reacted. It was a preemptive fear and a reading of danger into something that, you know, when I show up, everyone's just around a circle praying. I mean, literally praying. And so
Crazy, so scary.
Yeah. Well, and I just think it's important for, as a white person, if I'm going to speak against any kind of violence or lawlessness that would happen mixed with a protest, am I at least twice as loudly and clearly speaking against centuries of violence that have gone on and have affected, from a pastor's perspective, fellow image bearers of God? Am I equally concerned with that kind of violence? And if not, why? And just kind of interrogate myself. Why is it that this one bothers me more than this one? So some soul work needs to happen there, I think.
Wow.
And Shon, there's some other events coming up. Can you speak to those?
Sure. So we have a event that is planned for the week of June 22nd. And all of these guys that share the screen with me are very much an integral part of that. And what we have managed to do is we have managed to get our board of commissioners full support and sponsorship of what we will be calling going forward Beaver County Unity Week. And so this year we are going to kick off at Community College of Beaver County, where Dr. Davis is going to host us with our unified through understanding. And we're going to have some dynamic speakers. We're going to have food trucks. We're going to have some informational resources available for everyone. A real good time, right? Because we have to begin to advance our agenda forward. This is not about, our end game is not about a gathering or a walk. We have an end game in mind, right? And it's going to be a long haul because it's going to take some of us, as Mark said, some soul searching and some heart changing. It's going to take some of us that are in those seats of decision making to begin to want to hear African Americans and want to hear the white and black population that is actually beginning to form allies, form as an ally, right? So there are people that are standing up saying it's enough. So going forward with our scheduling, Thursday, June 25th, we will be at Geneva College at 6 p.m. and both those times are 6 p.m. We will be at Geneva College at 6 p.m. Most of the events will be, or activities will be identical, except for at Geneva College. We will come together for a moment of silence in reflection of George Floyd's death, horrific death, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Right? So we want to make sure we identify 8 minutes and 46 seconds that man knelt on his neck. And if you can sit there and watch your clock for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and put that in perspective, do you understand why African Americans are very, very frustrated? And last, we will meet up in Beaver at Beaver Area High School on June 27th at 10 a.m. And we're asking for everyone to come out. We're asking for everyone to share this with their family, friends, loved ones, co-workers, to come out and join us in this walk from Beaver Area High School to the courthouse steps, where we will have some dynamic speakers and some coming together in unity as we unite Beaver County. And again, I commend our county commissioners for getting behind this and supporting this, because I believe they, through their leadership, they want to see the county united, especially when we live in, as Dr. Sheffield pointed out, an excellent point, when we live in a white community, to now begin to want to accept our Black brethren. So those are some of the things that's going to be going on. And again, this is not a 1 week, one-off event. This will be annual. There was a proclamation approved by the county commissioners. So we're going to be looking for people to be a part of this for the long haul, especially when we start planning and putting together for our race relations conference, different things such as that. We're going to need people in the room so we can begin to push or propel Beaver County forward.
Thanks, Shon. That's exciting. That's exciting. That makes me, that's one of those just really good things I think that's happening in the world. It's one of the reasons we wanted to, and I want to thank all the speakers. You guys came together quickly. I just called you the end of last week and said, hey, can we do this? And really felt that, there are a lot of hearts right now that are open. And so we need to move forward, like you said, but that can't be the end.
Mm-hmm.
I like I like how you presented that. I want to move on a little bit and talk about the power of words, because I think that's just such an important thing. And so I want to start off with this word racism. And I'm curious to hear the sense of how would each of you define that word. And let me just say that I had a pretty deep conversation with my kids recently, and they both said to me, they're teenagers, but they both said to me, I don't remember learning about racism. Like, they have learned about racism. They're very aware, but they don't remember a specific, time. We sit down and we say, okay, you're this old, we have to talk about stranger danger. Like, kids remember a time, they had the talk, but they don't really remember learning about racism, but they certainly have. So Mark, I think we'll start with you. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you would define racism?
Yeah, so people who've been very helpful to me in this journey of understanding, which I'm still very much on, would define racism as prejudice plus power. And so the idea that all of us possess prejudices of all kinds, right? And again, as a pastor, that's a result of sin. We don't see each other as brothers and sisters. We create distance. And so those prejudices are going to exist in everybody in all kinds of different ways. But in terms of the communal identity, in terms of systems and structures, powers and principalities, some folks in the racial hierarchy that's been created, right? Brian Stevenson calls it the narrative of racial difference, that some of those folks, that prejudice they possess carries with it a kind of power to actually do embodied, functional, long-term systemic harm to another group of people, right? And so historically, we certainly see how that's been enacted white upon black. And so that's why for me, the term reverse racism doesn't work, because prejudice can go anyway, but the power that exists really exists this way. Yeah. So that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Prejudice can kind of go a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. But racism requires an element of power.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Shon, you want to add to that? Anything you want to add to that?
No, I have something, but let someone else. I'm processing what Mark just said right now. That was very, very fascinating. I mean, that was beautiful, man. How you put that, Mark. I don't even know if I want to add nothing to it.
Mhm.
Well,
I get it.
Sean was one of those guys who taught me that. So
I'll see that.
Mark's right on. I think one of the things that prejudice is how you distinguishing prejudice from racism is that prejudice can be both positive and negative.
Yeah.
You know, racism, you know, is ugly. And I will add to racism not just being about power, but it's about the unequal distribution of power. That it often rests with those who are in the majority. And it often creates situations where political will determines the distribution of that power. And the absence of people living in poverty and the absence of people of color amongst the power distribution, and let's just localize it, Beaver County, makes it even more difficult to erase the barriers of racism and address the unequal distribution of power. Take a look at who the power brokers are, what they control,
Yes.
and how unequal it is. And so people don't often forget that. And Jill, you can probably sense that it's also connected to the privilege of being white. But absolutely, this kind of unequal distribution, coupled with the fact that prejudice can be so negative, makes it really a dangerous thing in communities. And I think that's what we have to begin to address, that the manifestation of racism showing up in the unequal distribution of power and influence, because influence goes right along with power, makes it really a very difficult thing to overcome.
Yeah. Just to sprinkle a little bit of something else on what everyone's saying, like what Mark said is 100%. That's it for me. And as a school leader, it's something that I share, but something that's a little controversial and people don't like to hear. This is why, as a Black woman who's leading a school of white teachers and some Black teachers and Latinx folks, I stress to them that inherently, right, because of prejudice that we all have and power, inherently white people are racist, right? It is what you choose that differentiates whether you are living in your racism or whether you're becoming a co-conspirator or an ally for people of color. And so I think it's key to like name that and say it in a real way, because that's part of how do I become anti-racist? If I can't say and look in the mirror at myself and be like, hey, white person, I have all this power and privilege, I benefit from it, and I am racist, you're never going to get into the anti-racist. And that's a hard look and that's a harsh reality, but we all have to have those Issa Rae moments, that's what I call them, those mirror moments where we look in the mirror and we see our mirror self and we tell ourselves the things that we need to jumpstart ourselves, to move forward. And so I want to just name that in this space, because I saw someone in the chat was saying, well, how do I become an ally? Like for me, the first thing is that awareness. Are you aware that you are inherently racist because you're benefiting from this and your niceness doesn't have anything to do with it? I know some nice racist white people. Oh, they're so nice. But like it doesn't matter. Niceness has nothing to do with the fact that you have benefited from these things and you've yet to separate yourself and really show action. So I always like to say that, name it. A little controversial, I apologize.
No apology necessary. I love that.
But it is the real thing that people need to hear and hear it over and over again. I appreciate your niceness, but what I need you to do is to be aware and then to make the necessary changes.
Let me say something real quick, Jill, about what Lena also said, but she said quickly, and I want to jump back to it because it is so important to capture this. And I've said this over and over. People think that because you have Black folks around, you need Black figures to step up. That's only half true. White America needs to see Black folks in positions of power to dispel exactly the thing that she's talking about. That folks often develop these biases and prejudices for Black folks because they aren't distributed amongst power. To see Lena in the position that she's in is not only credit to her leadership skills, which go beyond Blackness. She's got them, but it's good for folks to see this person who happens to be Black, but has power and influence over because of the role that she has. And that's good for not just Black folks to see, but it's good for white folks to see. And I've said this over and over as I do training in many of these predominantly white school districts. I said, please don't think that you need a Black teacher because you have a few Black students. You need a Black teacher because you've got predominantly white students, and they need to see. If we're going to dispel these issues of racism, they need to see that diversity for themselves because they don't typically see it the way they live. And so I just want to make sure we don't miss this, that Lena is a prime example of how you do something about the notions of racism by making sure folks like her are in positions of power and influence in terms of the distribution of that. Because if an equal distribution of power, fosters racism, then we know that if we get some equitable distribution of it, it can help regress it. Thank you, Lena.
I always think too of racism, and you can tell me if you think this is a good way to look at it or not, but I think of racism as a continuum. So my opinion is, when white people say, well, I'm not racist, well, you're wrong. It is innate in us, I think, in a lot of different ways. Now, there's a continuum. So sometimes maybe my behaviors are further up the continuum and a little more racist, and hopefully more often they're further down on the continuum and not as racist, but it's part of us. Would you say that's a good analogy, or would you disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I think the further you get away from like choosing the inherently biased or discriminatory act, comment, word, actions, the closer you get to allyship, right? In my opinion, that's the first step. Then you become the co-conspirator. You become the man who puts his hand on the pole as they decided they're going to shock the pole where the woman, went up the flagpole to pull down the Confederate flag, right? Like that is the true vision or mission, right? Of like showing you're willing to risk your own health, your own wealth, your life for your Black or person of color sister and brother, right? When you step out there, right? And that's a far level, right? Like some folks just, like you said, are just at that beginning stage where it's like, oh, I'm here. Okay, I can stop saying those words or thinking that this young lady is about to steal from my store, right? That you make the steps. So I would agree. There is definitely a continuum. It's a process. It is hard to, I tell teachers this all the time, students, it is hard to unlearn bad behaviors. Ooh, it's so hard. It's why we fail on diets. It's why we fail on a lot of things, right? Like we make mistakes day after day because it is hard to unlearn things that the people, especially the people you love, right? Your mother, your father, your grandma, whomever raised you has poured into you and you love them unconditionally. And so the idea that something that they told you could be wrong, something they told you could be hurtful, something that they told you could kill someone else is like paralyzing to your family construct, paralyzing to who you are as an individual. And so it is not going to be a overnight, like, I'm not racist. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and be a different person. But as I say, and I've said to many of the people who are on this call, it is an everyday walk. Every day, the words you say, the choices you make that get you closer to being an ally, that get you closer to being how Christ intends us to be, right? Every single day, that is it. Yeah.
So let's talk a little more about white privilege. Jen, who is back there in the background, who helps us when we were practicing yesterday, she made a comment to Dr. Sheffield in particular that I thought was just so powerful to me. She said, Dr. Sheffield, when I hear the word white privilege, I feel guilty. And I feel, I forget the word she used, but guilty basically is what she said. So let's start with some definition and putting some parameters around what is white privilege. Who speak to us about that?
Peggy McIntosh, who's been one of the leading experts on white privilege, defines it this way. She says that white privilege is an invisible package of unearned assets associated with the race in charge. And basically what she says is that basically it's solely based on the fact that you happen to be of a particular race and, as we know, have the power. And oftentimes just being part of that race and that race having the power provides a lot of unearned assets. You have privileges just because you are of that race. And I nowhere and do I see that best, and everybody's kind of hit on it a little bit, is in the conversations that parents have with their children about their race. If you are African American, you know that you've got to prepare your child for living in a white world. You've got to prepare them, as Lena was. Take your ID with you, Lena, when you're walking. We have to worry about that. We have to worry about what people are going to do when they see you in the store and follow you. We have to worry about being faced with folks who look at your color and put you in a box, you know. And that was something that is associated with being Black. But whites don't have that issue. You know what I'm saying? You don't have to school your children about what they're going to face living in a white world. It's a whole different kind of context. And so I think the first thing you learn as a parent is the importance of schooling your child on what it means to have to, and the things you're going to be dealing with growing up Black. And whites have that as a privilege, but don't always see that as something that they have. And most of the things about white privilege are difficult for whites to see because they don't experience them like people of color.
Well, and so Dr. Sheffield, I think you would say that for your kids who are all grown now, they probably could look back and say, I remember when I was taught about racism. Whereas as Black children, whereas my kids say, I don't really remember ever being taught. I figured it out, you know, it was part of, but I never, and that's what I kind of hear you saying.
Yeah, well, I think
the privilege for my kids that they didn't have to.
Exactly.
Exactly.
My middle son, just the other day when we were talking about this, and we were talking about the conversations we had growing up, and he said to me, Dad, I remember how prepared I was the time I got pulled over with my two Black buddies in the car by a police officer who didn't have any reason to pull us over other than the fact that there were these big Black guys in the car. And when he came up to the car, he said, I remember not to make any moves, you know, keep my hands on the steering wheel, and don't even reach for my driver's license and registration until the police officer asked for it. Because his feeling was that he knew that the biggest thing he was being guilty of was driving while Black. You know, and that's sad. That's a sad thing, but it's reality for what we face as parents.
So first thing is to begin to recognize that there is an unbalance. And then, you know, second is to definitely get a true understanding of it, right? We need to get a true understanding of what white privilege is. I was saying to you earlier, Jill, you and Jen, you know, right now that word is, parallel to a negative connotation when you say white privilege, because people are, oh, it sounds offensive. It sounds And so, but when you get an understanding of what white privilege is, then you can actually see what people are of color, what black people are saying when we say, white privilege. It creates the barrier, right? And then once you get that understanding, we recognize it, get the understanding, then we have to understand, as our speakers put it eloquently, that, so are you going to put it to aside? Are you going to put it aside? Are you going to throw it away? Because if we don't throw it away, then all this is for naught. Because, the upper hand, the team that is winning always wants to win.
Mm-hmm.
We always want to win, right? So we got to understand, and we got to really firmly have a conversation within ourselves. Do we want to continue putting our knee on their neck? Or do we want to let up and let them breathe?
Shon, you said something yesterday that I remembered when we were talking about white privilege, about folks feeling guilty. You said something else about responsibility. Would you mention that and tell them what you said regarding that?
So I said that, see, this generation did not start racism, but this generation of white people are the most qualified to dismantle racism. And for white people not to feel guilty ever about racism, but they should feel that they have a responsibility to put an end to it. See, there's a responsibility that white people have. And we have to, and white people have to begin to understand the power that they do have, right? Because like Ms. Lena said, this is not ending tonight because of this conversation. But we got to start making some decisions in it. And I like that Issa Rae, because I like her too. But I like that those mirror moments, right? Do you want, and are you going to let your knee up off of their neck to live? When he walk into Beaver in the bank, or into Cafe Colache just to get a coffee like everybody else, am I going to stop thinking of him as a perpetrator and start valuing him as a person? This man is here just to get a cup of coffee. But just like Jeffrey Dahmer, we have to wait to see what he's going to do. We waited for Jeffrey Dahmer to grow up, and we allowed him to become a serial killer in this world. Allow black people, afford them that same opportunity to walk in the store and order their coffee before we judge them as a perpetrator.
I think that's what I really liked about when Shon, when you shared that yesterday, is sometimes I interact with white folks who will say, I didn't own any slaves. This isn't my fault. And so to have a way to kind of help educate them that doesn't make them feel, just so defensive, to say, you're right, you didn't own slaves. I didn't own slaves. We don't have to feel guilty for that, but we do have this responsibility as a way to use words to get people to really think and set aside some of that reptilian brain so they can think with the frontal cortex, and they can think logically and say, okay, wait a minute, this is not, let's think about this without all the emotion. I thought that was really, really powerful. So white privilege. Here's a quote, and this made me think when you were talking, Lena, because you said some really nice white racist people. So in this book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, which is a really good book. She's nice white people who really aren't doing anything other than being nice people are racist. Complicit with the system, and there is no neutral place. And that's kind of what the book talks about, is how sometimes with white privilege we think neutral is okay, and neutral is not okay. The other thing I want to talk about with words is the media, social media, and the news. and all these things of how things are portrayed. How would you say the media is impacting this issue that we're dealing with and that we have been dealing with for so long? Is it helping or is it hurting? Or maybe a little both?
I think the media is doing what it does, what it's always done. And that is to mostly, almost always, I hate to use like those big definitive terms, but portraying people of color in a negative light, right? Like, to Dr. Sheffield's point, a lot of people live in spaces in which they don't have any people of color to engage with. And I tell people this all the time. So what they see on television, in cartoons, in music videos, in newscasts, is what they think of our community and our people. And we are so much more than what is portrayed of us. And so if every description, you know, you see kids in t-shirts, I hope I don't fit the description. Every description is every little Black boy, 6 feet tall, dark skin, low haircut, you know, whatever the case may be, right? And I'm joking, but like, seriously. So I think the media is playing into the hype, which is why Mark said he received those phone calls in Beaver Falls, because the hype of Fox News, the hype of your local newspapers, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, all of those places, right, are showing the things to be afraid of, right? Those one-off situations, those things that may or may not have occurred, the one-sided view, right? Which is historical as well, right? The history books only show the one side. And they show us as the folk who are, you know, disenfranchised always, when again, we are much more than that. And so I think the media is doing what the media does. I think there are people, as always, who are trying to pull out and tease out the real truth and really shed light, which I think social media does, because you have the people who are boots on the ground, right? You have the grassroots people who are out there to be like, they said it was this, but let me tell you what really happened. I follow a rapper who was detained. She's an underground rapper. Her name is Chica. I don't know. I found her through Diddy. And she was detained by the police. And she said the reason it happened was they told them to clear out. She said, we did. But she's like, I overheard a police officer saying, take her. And she was like, I'm not going to let them take my manager. That's crazy. We did what they asked. But all you see is people were doing what they weren't supposed to be doing, right? So there are those people who have social media who get to use it as that platform to say, that's not the real truth. That's not the whole side. Let me show you. And I think that is what's been helpful. I think that is why we see movement, because people have seen footage of what's actually happening, right? Because this all could go another way if there was no video footage. It didn't happen then, right? So I think social media has been helpful, but I think the media is it's doing what it usually does, right? Showing the version of the people with the power and the privilege.
I think social media too has been ugly. Like, I go on social media sometimes and I think, wow, I thought I knew that person, but this is, I can't believe they said that, or I can't believe they posted that. Or, so I think sometimes we see the true ugliness, I'll call it, of people with social media too.
Yeah, and I think my wife and I have had a lot of conversations about this recently. She does some work down at Carnegie Mellon, where she is, with people who kind of study this stuff. And media, like if you're not in the room, the information is mediated, right? And so media is anytime you're not actually there to see it, right? So me having a conversation with you, that's mediated information. Kind of the structures of media, right? Be it written in newspaper or magazine, be it on TV, be it social, whatever it is. That media has transitioned very much for kind of bottom line reasons to be confirmation bias, right? And so it's that whole world where people are consuming a lot of media that is not intended to provide objective reality. And not that it ever really could, but it's very explicitly like algorithmically designed. If you click on this article, you're going to get 5 more like this that'll take you in that same direction, because that'll keep you coming back, right? And then in any direction you go. And so in terms of its helpfulness, absolutely can still be used as a helpful resource. We just have to be so discerning with it now And my concern is that a lot of us are not equipped to be quite that discerning when it comes to media that is intentionally just trying to confirm your current bias, because that's going to keep you coming back. So if that's our hope, we're pretty hopeless. But if we know how to filter what is being mediated, certainly it can be a helpful thing.
Yeah. I want to share real quick, we did a couple polls while we were talking with the community that's here listening and watching today. So one of the first question was, have you ever personally experienced racism? And 53% said yes, and 47% said no. And I suspect some of that has to do with the racial mix of our participants. The second question was, do you understand how race and racism has shaped your life? And I think this is promising. It says 84% said yes, that they do understand how race and racism has shaped their lives. So if that's accurate, but I think that's good. The last question was, do you understand the concept or reality of white privilege? And 89% said yes.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced a situation where you have benefited from white privilege? And 58% said yes. So when we're talking about awareness, I think we're getting there a little bit, at least from this tiny little poll. The last question is, how do you think Beaver County is doing addressing racism? And 58% said below average. 32% said average, 11% said above average. So the people that are here today really feel like we still have some work to do in the county.
Well, I find it's interesting, and I've been asking myself a rhetorical question in the midst of this COVID-19 epidemic, and my firm belief that the world will have a vaccine because the world needs a vaccine, and it has too much of an impact on economics not to do something about it. So in contemplating that, I asked myself this question: is there a vaccine for racism? And if there is, how to get people to take it? One of the things that I've learned, and being that I always like to talk about Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And Mark, I'm so glad you're here, because it was his letter to white ministers across the country to get them to join the civil rights movement. And as I reflect on what's happening over the last 3 months, particularly, or 2020, we're seeing probably for the first time, more of the ecumenical community speaking out against racism and against the impact that it's had. And so I'm looking for ways to inject, if you will, this social vaccine amongst our population. And I'm trying to figure out what is this vaccine, if you will, that we could inject people with socially in order to combat racism. I know part of it has to do with this power distribution, that we've got to get folks, people of color, in positions where they can actually be seen as purveyors of the power that's due them because of their skill. I think it also is wrapped up in training, that people need to really understand what cultural competency is, what we as Americans need in order to relate to folks that are different in a positive way. If that's part of this vaccine, then we need to inject folks with it. We need to also make sure that there's a consciousness in this country about what it looks like, so that we can get people feeling responsible for doing something about it. I think if there's anything good that came out of what happened with Amy Cooper, is that her employer fired her.
Mm-hmm.
That this will not be acceptable. This is not acceptable in America, that a person could display racism in such a way that we don't want you representing our company. And that action to me was a vaccination, was an injection. It was a message to to anybody that allows this to happen, and this person works for you. So I'm looking at ways that we can look at this issue of racism with some kind of social vaccination. But I think a lot of it goes with folks who have power and influence. And I think ministers play a huge role, can play a huge role with their congregations, many of whom are nice people, but still don't know they possess racist notions.
Yes.
And I have seen, if you saw the funeral of George Floyd, the second minister that spoke was white. And he quoted scripture, and he said, and I don't know if any of you saw this, but he said that if you love God, he who loves God and hates his brother is a liar.
Is a liar.
And he used that message to talk about why we need racial reconciliation amongst church folks. I see another message from another pastor locally with the same notion. So what I'm suggesting is that if we're going to do something about racism, we've got to connect to those same character centers, if you will, churches, if you will, that allow us, that can impact an awful lot of folks in a way that deals with the hearts of folks, which is very pertinent when you're talking about doing something with racism, because it lies in the heart.
So,
Dr. Sheffield, I would add to that vaccine empathy.
Yes.
I think if people had a little more empathy for, it's not my experience, but I can see your experience, I think that would add. So I'd put that in there. Shon, you wanted to say something?
yeah, sure. So I was wanting to go back to the poll because I found it interesting that there was a few people that were very honest, 11% that was really honest. I'm not saying that everyone was dishonest, but the number 4 question, right, on how have you ever realized that you have benefited from white privilege? And the 11% that said, can you tell us how? These are starting points.
Mm-hmm.
These are starting points, and these are places where we want to begin these conversations, right? So make us aware of how we're doing it, because then that helps me think that these people are open for, well, let's start to change this. And what we're going to need, what we're going to need as Black people, what we're going to need, I'm going to need you, when you see me in Walmart and people are acting, so I'm being, man, I'm losing all train of thought, but people are coming against me with microaggressions, I'm sorry, right? And you see women clutching their purses and you're with that person, you let them know not to do that.
Yes.
That's what I need. I need that help. Because most time, I'm just be truthful, I'm be real honest, as Shon Owens will always be. Most of the time, I don't even think about a white woman in the aisle with me. I'm focused on getting the freaking bread like my wife sent me to the store to get. I don't care less who else is in the aisle. I don't care less about your purse, because I got enough money to buy the bread.
Well, I think that's a powerful thing. It reminds me of a story, and so I'm just going to share and be a little bit vulnerable here, so please don't judge me. But, I didn't grow up here in Beaver County. I've been here since 1995, but I grew up in Baltimore, and it was just definitely a different environment, I'll say that. And when I went away to college, to a very white college, I would tell stories sometimes about my best friend in college. And this is what I would say, and I did not realize until someone pointed it out to me. I'd say, my best friend Corliss, she's Black. And then I would tell the story, and it never even crossed my mind. And then after a few years, someone said to me, why do you always tell us she's Black? Like, it doesn't pertain to the story. What's the point? I just never saw it. So I think you're right, Shon, when, you know, if I'm with another white woman in the store and she clutches her purse when she sees you, then I think that is my responsibility to say, hey,
you don't want your purse.
Yeah, what you doing?
Put down, girl.
Yeah, exactly.
And he got gray hair, and if he took it, he can't run that far anyways.
We can take him. We can get him. One of the questions that someone asked, I think, kind of fits in with this vaccination. And we had a couple comments where people said that was a really powerful
Yes.
comment to them, the vaccination. But someone asked, Nancy had asked, what symbols should we use to replace the ones that are coming down? And I think that kind of taps into what will we put in the vaccine to help those things?
Well, let me just say that, and some of the folks out there have probably been in some training sessions with me in cultural competency, and which I think is one of the ways that we can at least begin to get people think about vaccine. But I think what we have to really think through is, what are the missing pieces that need to offset some of the things that cause racism? What are the missing pieces, and how do we protect ourselves against that? Because that's what a vaccination does. It tends to protect you from falling victim to these kinds of things. So I think one of the things we have to do is think of ways that we could create an awareness in everyone about the dynamics of being in a country where there's diversity and what it's going to take for us to relate to each other. And I think one of the first things I tell folks, and Shon, you alluded to this, is that America is not a melting pot. And not everybody understands this. I don't think you can talk about America as being a melting pot and be conscious of the things that have led to where we are today, the racist things. America is not a melting pot. America is a salad bowl, always has been. We've just created a melting pot to allow folks to think that they could fade in, lose everything they brought, and fade into this notion of what American is. But we kept folks out of being melted a long time ago. What we are is a salad bowl. So we're full of carrots and olives and radishes and cucumbers and tomatoes and all of those things. But there's a skill that's required in order for us to be able to relate to carrots and olives, especially if you're a cucumber. So the idea is, in America, let's really understand the power of that skill. If you possess the ability to relate to folks that are different than you are in a positive way, you're culturally competent. If you don't possess the skill to relate to folks in a positive way, you are culturally incompetent and fall prey, to the disease of racism. So in order to receive this vaccination, if you will, you need to first understand your heart's got to change. You've got to shed this notion of being a melting pot and be receptive to being a salad bowl. Then the vaccination will work. You got to change your heart and understand that you can't judge folks by their color of their skin, but by the content of their character. You got to be able to see character. You can see character. The vaccine will work. You follow me? So there's a lot of things that we have to be able to do to get folks thinking differently about what it means to be an American. And so if we want to inject them with this vaccine, it ain't gonna work if you think you're in a melting pot, folks. You are in a salad bowl. It ain't gonna work if you can't understand that you've gotta be able to judge people for what's inside. So when Shon comes into the grocery store, you ain't got to worry about your purse. Find out who he is. You might find that's a pretty cool guy. He's just coming to get bread because his wife sent him there.
Right.
But what I'm trying to get you to see is that for the vaccination to work, we've got to undergo a change. And this is why I say the ministers are so important, because much of the change also is in the heart. If your heart is hard, the vaccine ain't gonna work. So the church can play a huge role in affecting the heart, because that's at the very center of of most houses of worship, most synagogues, of how we reflect their character. Mark,
So
you want to say something?
I want to move on at this point and talk about how we talk to our kids, because I think we've done a lot of good information today on how we're going to talk to the world and to adults. But kids see things differently. Kids experience things differently, and I think it's what's happening now. And what I'll tell you about my kids, I have a daughter who's 16 and a son who's 19, and they have very similar values, but they're handling what's happening in the world right now very differently. You know, my daughter's very even keeled, and even though she's angry, she's like, I'm going to go to the protest. I'm going to speak up. My son is just angry. He's like burn cop cars angry. I mean, he's not doing that, but that's the anger he has. And so I think, you know, we have kids going through different experiences with what's happening. So Lena, I'm kind of going to start with you because this is kind of your thing, dealing with kids. What are your thoughts about how we really talk to our kids about these types of issues?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it a lot last night, like after we kind of met yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, like, I kind of looked through like some of the things we had discussed, and I say to myself, I think it's very different how you speak to white children and how you speak to Black children. Because I don't necessarily, and I could be wrong, but I don't necessarily think there's a progression for my 6-year-old son. He has to know all the information, or as much as his 6-year-old brain can handle at this point, almost right away. And the reason I say that is because we have people like Tamir Rice, who was just a baby, right? Like, so if I wait until my son is 10 years old to tell him that he can't go outside and play with a gun, a water gun, or anything, if I wait, what is that going to do to Langston? So in my opinion, and what I've been working on in our school is this idea of like a canon of text. So something we've begun is, how do we share through reading, right, with our scholars, what race is and what racism is, right? So we do a lot of reading. There are shared texts that we use, and having discussion and letting kids tell you what they know. Because as I stated before, the media, the television shows they watch, the things where they see themselves and where they don't see themselves, it's present. And so avoiding it isn't the answer. So for me, it feels like early and often having conversations. I am very candid with Langston. We ride the bus in New York City and he saw a man being arrested and he asked me, is he a good person or did he do something wrong? And I was honest. I said, you know, Langston, maybe he did do something wrong. I said, but the fact is, because he's a person of color, because he's brown like us, he may not have done anything at all. And he may be being arrested, right? And so then we unpack that and we talk about, what does that mean? Why is that the case? Because even I think at the time he was 4 or 5, he understood, right? Because kids know what right, wrong, good, and bad are. And if I don't tell him that my brown skin is good, that my brown skin is worthy, then the world is going to tell him that it's not, and that he doesn't matter, and that he's not worthy. So it is of utmost importance, if I can like sum up what I'm saying, right? As a person of color, to begin early and often. But then I think as a white person, when you want to talk to your children, to your point, you were saying your kids didn't really have a conversation. I think it is also early and often. Like, let me tell you about what life is like, right? We have this thing called privilege. And so while you are doing this, and this, and it's thought of as, you know, fun, or you're just being a boy, or, you know, you're a sassy girl, or whatever it is, right, that they say about students, that there are injustices of other people, right? And here's how you can stand in the gap, right? I was listening to a graduation speech and a young man said he got suspended for walking through the drive-thru at a McDonald's on a field trip. And he was a Black kid. And I was really confused because I said to myself, if he was a young white man, they would have thought it was a silly joke and would have told him, oh, it's okay, go on with your day, right? And so I said to myself, like, what is that, right? Like, he probably was doing what any other boy would have done who was a teenager and having a good time. And so I think it's important as white people to know that, like, when you do certain things, the actions and the consequences are different, but how you can stand in the gap for your friend to be like, well, no, I was doing the same thing. And that's not fair for him to get that consequence, because it starts early at school, right? They see a 5-year-old who's upset and crying and have a tantrum as menacing and dangerous, and a little white boy who has a tantrum and cries in school as he just misses his mom and is expressing himself, right? It happens at 5. So my point is that it must happen early and often at a young age. For white people, it's like, here's how we can help our brothers and sisters of color. And as Black people, it's giving them the tools and the understanding. But to my friend's point in an article he wrote the other day, like, is it enough though? Also, right? Like, is it enough to have all the tools and the tactics without the allyship of white people who are going to stand in and step up when they see those microaggressions and those things happening in school? Think about my experience. I went to school with all white kids almost all my life. And I was pretty chill, I was docile. Not anymore, but I was, right? I submitted to my internalized racist ways because I have them. And I went through school with little or no problem. But what if I had gotten in trouble? I don't think there was a soul who would have stepped in and said, that's not Lena. We were all goofing off. We were all doing the wrong thing, right? We all were skipping class or went into the bathroom and lit something on fire. Who knows, right? So how do you teach your kids to step up and speak out against those injustices when they see them?
Well, and I think that speaks to that white privilege piece that you're saying, like with your son, you need to give him all the information early. He needs that to protect him. And that white kids have a privilege that they can live in this naive little world a little longer, and it's not so dangerous for them. But should they? And I think that's the question. I mean, I think the suggestion you're having about how you talk to Black kids early, you talk to your white kids early too. Have them really tap into that. And then the other thing I think is, when it comes to the news and social media, I think we need to really be direct with our kids about that, because and like Mark, you were saying with the algorithms and this and that, I mean, they can get down a rabbit hole really, really quickly that they may not be able to interpret.
But it's also positive, Jill, because I do believe, so it can be very negative, but it's also positive because I do believe, as Dr. Sheffield alluded to earlier, the color of the protesters is showing that social media is a positive connection right now, right? And what it is playing to white people's or young white people's inner self to say, that's not right, and I'm going to be a part of this. I'm going to stand up for this. And that makes me optimistic, and it gives me some little hope, right? Because, so I'll tell a quick story. So me and the wife went to Washington, D.C. because we wanted to see the museum. Always wanted to see the museum, right? The Black African-American Museum. We go in and it's like several stairs and several levels. And it's an all-day affair. Trust me, you will love it. So it starts at like 1600 and something when the first contact of African Americans making it to America, and it progresses all the way up to like 2016. So we're in the middle of this thing, and this white guy walks in with his daughter. She said, well, who is that? And he begins to explain who she is, and she was the first woman to run for president. And she was very important to the African-American community. And I turned my head around with this smile. I said, my God, I got this hope inside of me that there are some good white people out there that are trying and that are instilling some things into their little white children, that Black people are valued and are valuable to our community and to our society. Those are things that give me, that make me optimistic about this approach. And looking at those little white children on there holding up signs saying Black Lives Matter, even though their moms and dad are saying, you keep your butt in this house. But they're out of there because it's a bigger cause. And once white people begin to understand that it is bigger than them, then we begin to change. Because we live in an individualistic world and we have to get outside of ourselves that we're so glorious. We ought not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to.
So that would be a good thing, I think, too, Shon. You touched on that museum, is to expose our kids, both Black and white, to the history and to the positive things. Yeah, what my daughter and I recently watched Mrs. America, which was about the ERA, and really good show. But she said, I never knew that a Black woman ran for president, or was, in the running potentially. And so that's important stuff. So that's one of the ways we can help our kids too, with movies, using the media and the social media and art to really educate and touch in different parts of the heart and different parts of the brain. Talking to kids early. And I think talking to them as directly as possible. And then someone, Ellie put in the comments, she said also, if our children witness that you interact with everyone and respect them, it will be normal for them and they will see everyone as equal no matter the color of their skin. So I think that role modeling is important.
So it also speaks to, the inclusive history is part of that vaccination. It's part of what people need to hear and do. Parents, especially white parents, talking to their children, you can bet your bottom dollar that the death of George Floyd has a lot of white parents talking to their children about the atrocities of racism. I'm convinced of it, especially when I see a lot of church leaders that have congregations talking about it. Those conversations are happening. They have to happen. And all of those things, begin to help us understand the vaccination for racism and how we can begin to see folks moving in a direction that's going to allow a greater awareness of what's happened to the plight of Black people. And so, when I see, and I agree, I've been inspired by seeing many young white folks holding up signs that say Black Lives Matter. Hallelujah. I mean, it's just so refreshing when you see that kind of thing going on today in America. So I'm hopeful. I'm very optimistic that we're going to get there because at least now the momentum has changed and the inclusiveness of the folks that are interested has changed.
Well, and I think too, and I'm going to get you there, Mark, in 1 second. I apologize. But I always think of the stages of change when the stages of grief, the old stages. We have some new stages now, but the old stages that most people are familiar with, denial, bargaining, depression, angry, acceptance. When all this was happening, my kids are both very angry and they tell me, look what happened to this, look what happened to this. And one time I said to the kids, I said, I don't want you to, sometimes I don't want to hear it right now. They're in a very angry stage. I'm in a very sad stage. And that goes up and down. Those stages of grief don't stay in one spot. But I think to help kids understand that it's okay, that there's a range of emotions that you might experience when you're dealing with what's happening in the world right now and what has happened in the world in general, and that's okay. Mark, do you want to add to that?
So having three children, 13, 11, and 8, and just some of my own internal process when talking to my children about these things. One of them, recognizing it is not developmentally appropriate or healthy for any child to have to confront the depth and the ugliness of this sin, right? And so it's going to feel like too much. It's going to feel hard and awkward, and it is. That's because it is. Like, that's the reality of the fallenness and the reality of the sin. Recognizing that privilege, though, and saying, therefore I won't, when that is something that as a matter of survival, is not afforded to our sisters and brothers of color. And so, yes, it's a hard conversation, but it's nowhere near as hard as it is when you're trying to actually equip someone to navigate this dangerous world. And so there's responsibility to talk about it. And I appreciate the affirmation that you're all given and how encouraged you are. And I want to just challenge a little bit. So I was looking at the invite list to see if anyone's going to get me in trouble for saying this. I want to challenge us as white people a little bit. That this is those who would identify as conservative or those who would identify as very progressive in the white community. Parents today, white parents today, are choosing to live in segregated neighborhoods and send their kids to segregated schools in the name of safety and quality education. And we are making it almost impossible for our children to be genuinely equipped to be about the anti-racist work that we want to see them do. Because we can have conversations in the abstract, right? We can talk about the ideas, but the power of proximity, if this is not a lived experience and the empathy of my kids with their friends, right? This isn't Black people. These are their friends. And the learning that happens there, it looks different at every stage. And so when my son went to middle school and some of his Black friends started to accuse him of being racist. And so then I have to have a conversation with my son about how much of this is their own coming to understand the reality of the pain and where to put that. And so how to not take it personally, to be introspective, but also to recognize it's bigger. Like, it's not me saying, okay, we need to have this conversation now and trying to, in the abstract, it's because of the lived experience, right? And so if we don't take seriously where we live, where we send our kids to school, and how that impacts our kids, right? Because it's that old adage that children never fail to ignore what their elders say, but they never fail to imitate what their elders do, right? And so if we're actually living this thing in that way, I'm sorry, I know my dog is barking, apologies. So yeah, I guess that's the challenge. Yes, let's talk about it, and let's do the books and the movies and all of that. But if we are not proximate, if we are in a monoculture, it is 95% impossible to effectively do the stuff we're talking about doing with our white children.
Sounds like a vaccine. Sounds like a vaccine to me.
Can I say, that's why I love my white friend, Mark Duget. I love him. That we were instant friends. That's why I love him. Because this is what we need right there.
Me too, Shon.
That look like Mark.
Well, and I think to your point, Mark, when we look at those demographics of Beaver County, there are a lot of places that you're hard pressed to find someone who is not white. And so it's, that.
I've been in meetings where, when Shell Cracker Plant was starting up, been around since that, right? Sitting in meetings and people saying, we're guiding them to Center Township, because that's the best. And it's like, whoa. I know some inner secrets about Center Township in Central Valley because my children graduated from there. It's not like they're the best. And these are the things that we have to begin to talk. And now let's put on the table. Let's put these things on the table and let's stop with these myths that this place is great and is safe. Because there's so many things that we have to begin to factor in about safe and what's better. Because because it's who is for or who's making that argument of what's safe and what's better, right? Because my children graduate. One of my daughters was the first one to graduate from the combined school of Central Valley, and came from Aliquippa. And almost a little bit of the myth was in my head, but when she came home and she surpassed all of her counterparts in her class, and my daughter was a honor society student at Central Valley. I said, oh, maybe the myth is not real.
Anything else that we're gonna get ready to wrap up? One thing, Shon, we did have someone ask, could you give us those dates one more time for the upcoming Unity events?
So June 23rd, that's a Tuesday. We're going to be at Community College of Beaver County. June 23rd, we're going to be at Community College, at 6 o'clock p.m. June 25th, that's a Thursday, we're going to be at Geneva College, Reed's Field, at 6 p.m. June 27th, we're going to gather at Beaver Area High School. There will be transportation to take you back to your car once you make the walk. We have worked that out with Mr. Fry. He has graciously donated buses, and we're going to have 2 ducky boats for our elderly. They can get in and ride and have fun. They don't have to walk the walk. They're going to ride the walk. So we got that for them on June 27th. So I'm looking forward to this. 10 a.m.
10 a.m.
Tell all your family, friends, and children, and bring your dog and your cats. Put them on leashes, but pull them out.
And at the courthouse, once everybody gets to the courthouse, there's some speakers there.
Yes, ma'am. There's going to be some dynamic speakers there.
You know, one of the speakers that my daughter really loved in Beaver Falls was that kid. That there was a young person there that spoke, and she found that, you know, as a young person, she just found that really powerful. So I thought that whoever thought of that, what a great job.
So we're definitely going to have young speakers at every event. We have them lined up. Actually, Miss Lena will be one of our featured speakers as well at the event. So I'm looking very, very forward to that, of hearing Lena. And some of our younger, teenage speakers are going to be there too. So yeah, we got a powerful lineup for every event. I won't be speaking, but yeah.
That it's going to be it sounds fantastic. And I think just what our county needs right now, we still do have this pandemic. I mean, we're green today, but I haven't figured out exactly what that means. But so to know that there's multiple things going on, there's still good stuff going on, even though our world's in a little bit of a funk. If anybody has any last questions you want to add, then please put them in the Q&A part. Is there anything that any of our speakers want to just add about the topics we've talked about so far?
Well, I'm looking at a question that was asked by one of the panelists regarding some of the partners that can help with this eradicating racism. And I mentioned the Chamber of Commerce and some of the things that have been happening there with their leadership program, which I think is very interesting. The Chamber of Commerce has a leadership program, and they've been receiving training on cultural competency. How do you, as a leader, infuse into your organization the principles that allow folks to interact together positively? And that's known as cultural competency. And I think it's really important to understand that the Chamber has been a real ally in helping us address these areas of racial reconciliation and dealing with issues of cultural competency. So that's been real positive. Also, the work of the Chamber, as well as IDAC, came up with a diversity award last year. And was given out for the first time.
Who won that award?
Huntington Bank, yay! And I say yay because that's my bank. But I have been I've been real critical of the banking industry. I have been real critical because it tends to be very, very white. And they didn't always have the best customer service when it's coming to people of color walking in the bank.
Wow.
We've seen major changes. As a matter of fact, if you go to Huntington Bank's website right now, you should read their statements on combating racism. It's amazing what they've been trying to do. So there have been activities going on in this county, and we hope to do this annual diversity award in cooperation with the Chamber and the Inclusion and Diversity Awareness Council, that Shon chairs. So there's some things going on in that combat racism, and one of somebody in the audience, I think it was Tony Guy, raised the issue about what can we do, what's happening within the Chamber and other venues that allow us to see how we can have these partners in combating racism. And you know me, I am a huge advocate for our religious community to get on board and join us in addressing these issues of racial conciliation and racism.
Well, and Jack Manning just posted up there, just a reminder that Dr. Sheffield, you last year were the Citizen of the Year. Well deserved.
Well, that's it. I think if that honor, I believe, it was directly related to having the opportunity to talk about cultural competency within this community, and how many folks have been embracing, you know, this notion that we need these salable skills if we're ever going to be a good citizens of this country. So when I received that award, it was me a tribute to people being receptive to this idea of cultural competency, and I was so honored.
That's good.
Thank you, Jack.
Dr. Sheffield, when I saw your training, one of the things I notice about you is when you're training and when you're up in that powerful position, you're such a powerful speaker, and you often say, "Do you hear me?" Like it's like your tagline, and it's so like engaging. And I do a lot of public speaking, so I decided I was going to try it. But when I do it, it just comes off as like your mother. Like, do you hear me? And so you got that, but I can't use that skill. Maybe I can work on it. But I did want to share a couple really great things, and I'm going to share my screen here, and because there are still good things going on in the world, a lot of good things going on in the world. So look at this. This is Lena's son, Langston, who just graduated kindergarten. Those are the most adorable pictures I have ever seen. That second one where he's throwing his hat up. So now you have a first grader.
I do. It was hard to get these great pictures. I was like, these are the best two, but there's some other ones.
They're incredible. Just an awesome job. And then some other good news we thought we'd share. This is Jen's son. He graduated from Gateway School District, graduated high school. They had their graduation in the Macy's parking lot, which I thought was creative, if nothing else. And then just to follow on, this is my daughter. She just got her driver's license. So if you see her driving a little red Toyota Civic, you're just pull her over, tell her mother's proud of her, and she better be good. But lots of other good news and things going on in the world too. Anything, let's see, we have a quick question. Renee says that the second person in the United States was cured of HIV this week. Cured. That's amazing to me. Thank you for sharing that with us. Because that's important. That is good, important stuff. So I love hearing those types of things. And let's just see if we have anything else. Do you hear me? Oh, and growing up Sheffield. That's the other thing you say, Dr. Sheffield. And Jen was reminding us.
Just comment real quick. And this is a confession for me. And I just want everybody to understand, when I talk about folks being culturally competent, I am really pointing the finger at myself. Because cultural competency is a universal skill. It's not something that you just need because you're white or black. Everybody needs it. And I confess this when I talk about cultural competency. I traveled from Beaver County, where I grew up, to San Antonio, Texas, when my son was in the military. And I arrived in San Antonio, Texas, and it didn't take long to realize I was out of my element. Because when you get to San Antonio, you recognize there is a huge Hispanic population.
Yeah.
Huge. I have not seen anything like it. And I say, oh my gosh, my diversity all my life has been white folks. And you don't learn all of America by just knowing about the ethnic group that happens to be around you. I am a work in progress when it comes to being culturally competent. I gotta keep learning, because this is a salad bowl we live in, and those lettuce and carrots and options are right there with me. And so I think it's important for everybody to understand that cultural competency is a skill for all of us. Yeah. We all need it. We all need to understand how it can prepare us. It can vaccinate us for the kinds of things that we need as we go through, get beyond Beaver County. You know, so I want to make sure everybody understands that. I don't want to think that cultural competency is just for white folks. Oh, no. It's for all of us.
Yeah. And
Okay.
just like,
Go
oh,
ahead.
just to like round out that same thought, I always, and I've shared with others on this call, like this idea of being anti-racist and anti-biased to Dr. Sheffield's point of like cultural competency. And that is a huge, huge piece, right? We discussed that the idea of racism is prejudice and power, but we all have to tap into that idea that we have those prejudices. And something that is being said, and it's like, none of us can be free until there's freedom for all of us. And that means Mexican, that means those of us who have gender identities that are different. That means trans individuals, right? All of those things are encompassed in that idea of being anti-racist and anti-bias. And so if I can leave you guys with 4 things in a way to like get there, right? It's 1, awareness, right? So like mirror moment, take your mirror moment. 2, educate yourself, right? I saw the same thing that Emily posted, right? What can you find, Emily? What are the resources? 3, then it's taking that time to do some more self-reflection. And maybe that looks like with some friends and just unpacking what you've read and what you've learned and who you are and your identity that's been shaped. And then taking the community action. It doesn't take but 1 or 2 people to change the way you address people, the words you use, the actions that you do in your daily life, those steps, to Jill's point, that move you further away further down, right? The racist or bias spectrum. And like Dr. Sheffield said, when I spoke about internalized racism, that is part of those biases that I have and unlearning things that have been told to me, that I shouldn't wear my natural hair, that I shouldn't have, when I've been snapping my fingers, right? Years ago, I would have never been doing this on a platform in front of people, but that's me. I get to celebrate the words that my colleagues and folks on this panel say. I get to laugh and do those things, right? And so all of that, we all have a work to do. And when we all do the work, then the salad tastes good.
That's good. And so I'll leave with this, and that's excellent, Lena, taking from both of Dr. Sheffield and Lena's points, that Dr. Sheffield said earlier about how us as African Americans have to learn how to operate in a white world. And that is so very true. And it was evident when I was a little boy, when my great grandmother would answer the phone, and she's, hey, you guys sit down and shut up and blah, blah. And then the phone rang, and then she goes, hello, how you doing, sir? And I'm like, well, who is that? Who is this person? And she was just, right? And what I've learned out of that was I had to learn how to speak multiple languages in this world. And I'm not just talking about being, bilingual in terms of speaking Mexican and Italian. I'm talking about learning how to operate in white worlds, in Hispanic worlds, in Italian worlds, whatever. And I believe that white people need to understand the value in how to operate in the African American world and what it's like in our world, and to come over and bring your values and let's intermingle those in African American worlds as well. And I think that'll help. That's part of the vaccine too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else have anything you want to add? We had a little comment come up here by my dear friend Courtney. Courtney, she'll always be Courtney Dawson to me, but she's Courtney Rainey now. And you talked earlier about Lena and the position that she's in and how she's moved so forward. And Courtney's a good example of that too. Courtney was my administrative assistant many, many years ago. And she, while she was working, finished her bachelor's degree. Then she went on to finish her master's degree, got a little family, and now she's doing really great things in leadership. I'm really, really proud of her. But she put something up here, and I'm going to tell you, I'm totally ignorant to this. All she said was code switching. And I see that you said yes. So somebody knows what this means. I do not.
I mean, it's what Shon said, code switching. When I'm with my friends, the way that I talk, the things I say are, for my friends. And when I step in front of my staff as the principal, there's a certain way I talk. But also what I've recognized is like there's a way to infuse those two for me to be authentically myself, because it's not fair that as a Black person, right? Sometimes, you know, I go back and forth, like code switching, is it good? Is it bad? Right? But like, it's not fair that as a Black person, I feel like I can't be my true self in front of folks, because then they won't see me as a leader. They'll see me just as a Black woman. Whereas
Gotcha.
if I can take a little bit of both and infuse it so that my staff sees me as Lena, the person, and Lena as the leader, and those two things together. Because I don't think that
I love that.
one without the other does, you know, like, then that's not me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so code switching is something that often many of us, you know, that's how we've come up on the rise.
And tell Vicky I said thank you. She said I was so adorable. Vicky Sure.
He's talking about Langston.
Well, actually, when I read it, I thought she was talking about Dr. Sheffield. I realized she's talking about Langston. Well, we're gonna, I think, wrap up here. Shon, I want to thank you especially because I reached out to Shon. Shon and Dr. Sheffield were the first ones I reached out to. Shon put me in contact with Lena and with Mark, and such a great addition to the panel today. And
It was a no-brainer.
Very inspiring to myself, and I'm sure the people that were viewing. Thank you all so much for everything that you're doing to just, you know, save the world. That's my thing. We all got to save the world, and we got to work at it if we're going to do it. And to all the people that watched today and took time out of your day, I thank you guys too, because that's part of the solution, is being able to learn more. And now I know what code switching is. So. All right, at this point, I am going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you all so much. Be safe, be strong, and save the world.
Have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.